The night before D-Day was dark and restless, the weight of history that had not yet been written. Over the English airfields, a chill wind moved through lines of aircraft waiting in silence, their engines quiet for now, like beasts ready to wait. The smell of fuel and rain filled the air. Hundreds of young men stood beside them, each one burdened with more than just equipment. Among them stood Private James Miller of the 6th British Airborne Division, his hands cold inside his gloves as he checked his rifle for the 5th time. He looked up at the cloudy sky and wondered what France would look like in the morning. Around him, his brothers in arms moved with quiet focus. Some adjusted straps. Some smoked their last cigarettes. Some just stared into the dark, lost in thought. The order had come only hours ago. They would be among the first to enter France, dropped behind enemy lines to capture a bridge near a small village called Boonville. It was called Pegasus Bridge, and their job was to hold it, no matter what. James was 22, tall, thin, and had the kind of nervous smile that came from pretending not to be afraid. He thought of home, his mother in Kent, the way she stood at the garden gate when he left, her face calm but her eyes shining. "Come back soon," she had said. He didn't have the heart to tell her that maybe he wouldn't. Around him, men talked softly. Corporal Davis, who always joked too loud, tried to make them laugh, saying, "We'll be in Paris by breakfast." Nobody laughed, but everyone smiled, because it was better than thinking about what was coming. The air was cold enough to sting, and when the sound of engines started to rise across the airfield, James felt his stomach tighten. The moment had come. The Dakotas waited long, gray planes with open doors and red lights glowing faintly inside. As they climbed aboard, the sound grew louder. The engines thundered, drowning out every word. Inside, the plane was small and packed with men. The smell of oil and sweat mixed with metal and fear. James sat against the wall, his parachute heavy against his back, his helmet pressing into his head. Across from him, Sergeant Harris gave a thumbs up and shouted something he couldn't hear. The floor vibrated as the plane began to move. Outside, rain streaked across the small windows like silver lines. Then, with a jolt, they were airborne. The lights of England disappeared below, swallowed by blackness. All that was left was the sound, the endless roar of engines and the wind rushing against the fuselage. For a while, no one spoke. Some men closed their eyes. Others stared into nothing. James tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he thought of his little brother, Tommy, who had begged to see his uniform before he left. "You look like a hero," Tommy had said. James hoped he'd still believe that when the war was over. The plane shook violently, and the officer at the front, Lieutenant Carter, raised his hand 10 minutes to jump. Red light on. The men checked their equipment one last time, tightening straps, pulling cords, slapping each other's shoulders in silent courage. Carter's voice came through the noise, "Remember the mission. Secure the bridge. Hold until relieved. Nothing else matters." The words cut through the roar like a blade. The green light came on. The door slid open. Cold air rushed in, fierce and wet, filling the plane with chaos. One by one, the men stepped forward and vanished into the night. James felt the wind tear at his clothes as he jumped. For a few seconds, he was falling through pure darkness, no sky, no earth, just the scream of air around him. Then the violent jerk of the parachute opening above. Silence followed, deep and strange. He floated through the black sky, the moon hidden behind clouds. Below, flashes of gunfire lit the ground. Tracers arced upward like burning lines. He could hear distant explosions. The Germans were awake. James drifted toward the ground, heart pounding. All around him, other parachutes opened, ghostly white flowers in the dark. Not all made it. Flak burst nearby, shaking the air. A plane above him caught fire, a trail of orange tearing across the sky before it fell into the fields below. The sound of it crashing echoed through the night. James hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. He landed in a flooded field, water soaking his boots and uniform. For a moment, he lay still, listening. Gunfire crackled somewhere nearby. He cut himself free from the parachute and crawled toward the hedgerow, trying to get his bearings. The compass glowed faintly in his hand. He was off course. But he wasn't alone. He found Sergeant Harris and two others moving through the mud, their silhouettes sharp against the faint light of distant flares. "You all right, lad?" Harris whispered. James nodded, still catching his breath. "Then move. We've got a bridge to find." The words were calm, almost steady. They began walking, hunched low, rifles ready. The countryside was strange, flat fields, narrow paths, scattered trees. Every now and then, a cow mooed softly, confused by the noise of war. The air smelled of smoke and wet earth. Flares lit the sky in white bursts, turning night into ghostly daylight for a few seconds at a time. Once, they heard shouting in German and froze. Footsteps passed close, too close. James held his breath. The patrol moved on, unaware. Only when the sound faded did they start breathing again. They found more men along the way, some from their own unit, others lost like them. One man had broken his leg on landing but still clutched his rifle. They helped him to a ditch and promised to send medics later. The world felt unreal, like a dream made of fear and silence. Every noise was too loud. Every shadow felt alive. James thought about how the world had seemed so big before the war. Now it felt small, just the few feet of ground in front of his boots. By the time they reached the canal, dawn was just beginning to touch the horizon, a thin line of gray behind the trees. That was when they saw it, Pegasus Bridge, stretched across the dark water like a thin thread of steel. Smoke drifted from the far end, and flashes of gunfire lit the mist. The battle had already begun. The first glider troops had landed hours earlier, in what would later be called one of the most daring landings of the war. Their gliders had come in silently, almost crashing into the fields beside the bridge. The men had stormed it in minutes, taking the Germans by surprise. But now the enemy was counterattacking, and the fight was desperate. James and his group joined the defenders, crawling through mud and smoke. The sound was deafening, machine guns rattling, grenades exploding, men shouting orders and curses. The bridge was lit by flashes of fire, bullets sparking off its metal rails. A German half-track appeared on the road, its gun blazing. The British fired back with everything they had. Harris grabbed the PIAT launcher, took aim, and fired. The explosion threw him backward as the half-track went up in flames. The heat washed over them, mixed with the smell of burning fuel and the screams of engines dying. "Good shot, Sarge," someone yelled. Harris just grinned, wiping soot from his face. They held the bridge inch by inch. James fired until his shoulder ached. He saw men fall beside him. Corporal Davis, the Joker, was hit by shrapnel but kept crawling forward, firing with one hand. Lieutenant Carter took a bullet to the arm and refused to leave. Every man knew what this meant. If the Germans took the bridge, the tanks heading from the beaches would be trapped. The invasion could fail before it began. There was no room for fear now. Only purpose. By midday, the fight had turned into a test of endurance. The Germans kept coming, bringing mortars and snipers. The air was thick with smoke. James's throat burned from the smell of gunpowder. His ears rang from constant explosions. When the shooting paused, even for a second, the silence felt too loud. He looked across the bridge and saw a German soldier lying on the ground, barely breathing. For a strange moment, their eyes met, two young men who might have been friends in another life. Then the soldier went still, and James looked away. As hours passed, rain began to fall again, soft at first, then heavy. It washed over their faces, mixing with blood and sweat. The bridge was slick with water, the canal below dark and cold. James felt exhaustion settling deep in his bones. He hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. But every time his hands began to shake, he thought of home, of Tommy waiting, of his mother's face, of all the people who believed they would win. And somehow, he kept going. Then, sometime in the late afternoon, they heard the deep, distant rumble of engines from the west. The sound grew louder, stronger, until it was unmistakable. British tanks. Reinforcements. The men on the bridge started shouting, waving their helmets, cheering through tears. Some laughed, others just sank to their knees. They had done it. Against all odds, they had held the bridge. When the first British armor arrived, the soldiers who had fought all night looked like ghosts covered in mud, eyes hollow, uniforms torn. But they were alive. Pegasus Bridge was secure. James sat down on the edge of the canal, too tired to stand. The water rippled softly below, carrying bits of debris, a helmet, a piece of wood, a rifle floating slowly downstream. The air was still full of smoke, but the firing had stopped. The world was quiet again. He looked up at the sky, where the clouds were breaking apart, sunlight pushing through in pale gold streaks. Somewhere behind him, Sergeant Harris lit a cigarette and said softly, "We did it, lads." His voice trembled. No one answered. They didn't need to. As night returned, the men sat together around a small fire, sharing the silence. Some spoke of home. Some didn't speak at all. James felt the weight of everything that had happened, the faces of the men who wouldn't be going home, the sound of parachutes opening, the fear, the courage, the strange beauty of survival. He realized that war wasn't just about enemies or victories. It was about holding on when everything inside you wanted to give up. Days later, they would move on to new positions, new battles. But Pegasus Bridge would remain the symbol of something greater, the courage of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. For the rest of his life, James would carry that night inside him. He would remember the silence before the jump, the sound of his parachute opening, the faces in the rain, and the bridge that changed the world. Years later, when he returned to France as an old man, the bridge was still there. It had been rebuilt, painted, and turned into a monument. Tourists walked across it, taking pictures, unaware of the ghosts that still lingered there. James stood at the railing and looked down at the calm water, seeing not the peace of the present, but the fire and chaos of that night. He could almost hear the voices: Harris shouting orders, Davis laughing, Carter's calm voice cutting through the storm. And for a moment, he was 22 again, standing in the rain, holding the line. Pegasus Bridge was more than metal and stone. It was a memory of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Of young men who faced the darkness together and refused to let it win. The night before D-Day, they jumped into hell and found their way to history. And though time had faded their faces, their story still echoed in the wind that moved softly across the water, a whisper of bravery that would never die.